He looked at me across our anniversary dinner table, rolled his eyes at the single red rose I'd bought myself, and said those words that would change everything. "Honestly, Claire, you're 52. This whole romance thing is embarrassing. Act your age." I smiled, finished my wine, and walked out of that restaurant knowing I'd never walk back in as his wife. What he didn't know was that his brother Marcus had been waiting in the parking lot with a ring in 20 years, worth of unspoken truth. And by morning, David would discover that some women don't fade with age. They just find better men who see their fire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Claire Donovan, and until 3 months ago, I thought I knew exactly what my life was supposed to look like. Married for 26 years to David Donovan, mother to 2 grown daughters who rarely called, living in the same colonial house with the same beige walls and the same routine that had slowly drained every ounce of spontaneity from my soul. I taught 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary, came home to cook dinner that David barely acknowledged, and spent my evenings watching him scroll through his phone while I read romance novels he constantly mocked. The signs had been building for years, but I'd trained myself to ignore them like background noise. The way he'd grunt when I suggested date nights. How he'd shake his head when I bought a new dress, muttering about waste of money. The complete absence of any physical affection that wasn't purely functional. I told myself it was normal, that marriages settled into comfortable patterns, that expecting butterflies at 52 was childish dreaming. But something shifted the day I turned 52 last April. I woke up early, made myself coffee in my favorite ceramic mug, and sat on the back porch, watching the sunrise paint our garden gold. David was still asleep, snoring in that way that used to be endearing but now felt like nails on a chalkboard. I found myself thinking about all the things I'd stopped doing, stopped wanting, stopped asking for. When had I become this quiet, accommodating version of myself? That morning, I decided to plan something special for our 26th anniversary in June. Not because I felt particularly celebratory, but because I wanted to test something. I wanted to see if there was anything left worth saving, or if we'd finally reached the point where we were just 2 strangers sharing mortgage payments and grocery bills. I made reservations at Bella Vista, the Italian place downtown where we'd had our first real date back in 1997. I bought a new dress, deep emerald green that made my auburn hair look richer, and brought out the green flecks in my hazel eyes. I even splurged on new heels, the kind that made me feel taller and more confident. For the first time in months, I felt like I was remembering who I used to be, before I became David's wife and the girls' mother. The day of our anniversary, I spent extra time getting ready. I did my makeup carefully, chose jewelry that actually matched, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who still had something to offer the world. David barely glanced up when I came downstairs, just mumbled something about being ready when I was, like we were heading to a parent-teacher conference instead of celebrating nearly 3 decades together. At the restaurant I tried. God, I really tried. I asked about his work at the insurance company, complimented the wine he'd chosen, even brought up the trip to Ireland we'd talked about taking for years. His responses were mechanical, distracted, like he was tolerating an obligation rather than enjoying an evening with his wife. When the waiter brought our entrees, I reached across the table and touched his hand, something I used to do all the time when we were younger. He pulled back slightly and said, "Claire, what's gotten into you tonight? You're acting strange. Strange. For trying to connect with my own husband. For wearing a dress that made me feel beautiful. For wanting romance on our anniversary." I felt something crack inside my chest, but I kept my voice steady and asked, "What do you mean?" That's when he looked at me with this expression of mild annoyance, mixed with something that might have been embarrassment, and delivered the words that would end our marriage. "Honestly, Claire, you're 52. This whole romance thing is embarrassing. Act your age." I sat there for a moment, letting it sink in. Not just the words, but the tone, the dismissiveness, the complete lack of recognition that the woman sitting across from him had spent 26 years putting his comfort before her own happiness, raising his children, managing his household, and supporting his career while slowly disappearing into the background of her own life. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene that would give him more ammunition to use against me later. I simply smiled, took a sip of my wine, set my napkin on the table and said, "You're absolutely right, David. It's time I started acting my age." Then I stood up, walked out of that restaurant, and didn't look back. What I didn't expect was to find Marcus leaning against his truck in the parking lot, looking like he'd been wrestling with his own demons. David's younger brother by 4 years, the one who'd never married, never settled down, never stopped looking at me like I was worth looking at. He straightened when he saw me, and the concern on his face was so immediate and genuine that I almost started crying right there in the parking lot. "Claire, you okay?" I was just leaving Murphy's pub and saw David's car. "Figured you two were on a date night." He paused, studying my face in the streetlight. What happened? I could have lied. Could have made excuses or brushed it off like I'd been doing for years. Instead, I heard myself saying, "He told me I'm too old for romance." That wanting affection at 52 is embarrassing. Marcus's jaw tightened in a way that reminded me he'd always been the brother with fire in him, the one who'd chosen adventure over stability, travel over settling down. He said, "What?" Something about the way he asked it, like David's words were not just wrong but personally offensive to him, made me look at Marcus differently. We'd always gotten along well at family gatherings, had easy conversations about books and travel, and the kind of dreams David had long since dismissed as impractical. But standing there in that parking lot, I noticed things I'd trained myself not to see. The way he was looking at me. The way he'd always looked at me. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" The words came out before I could stop them. "Anything." "Do you think I'm too old?" "For romance. For feeling beautiful. For wanting someone to notice when I put on a new dress?" He was quiet for so long I started to regret asking. Then he stepped closer. Close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the silver threading through his dark hair, and said, "Claire, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever known. And that's not something that changes with age. That's something that deepens." The air between us shifted. 26 years of carefully maintained boundaries. Of being David's wife and Marcus's sister-in-law. Of pretending I didn't notice the way conversations flowed easier with him. The way he remembered details about my life that my own husband forgot. All of it dissolved in that parking lot under the flickering streetlight. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice lower now. "Something I should have said years ago, but couldn't because you were happy. Or I thought you were happy." My heart was beating so fast, I could hear it in my ears. "Marcus, I'm in love with you. I have been since the day David brought you home 27 years ago. And watching you disappear a little more each year, watching him take you for granted, it's been killing me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made my breath catch. "I carry this everywhere, like some kind of masochist. Bought it 5 years ago and keep thinking maybe someday." I stared at the box, then at his face, then...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Back at the box. "Are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" "I'm asking if you'd consider the possibility that your life could be completely different. That you could be with someone who thinks romance at 52 is just the beginning. Someone who's been waiting his whole life for the chance to love you properly." I thought about David inside the restaurant, probably checking his phone and wondering when I'd stop being dramatic and come back to finish my salmon. I thought about going home to our beige walls and his indifferent silences and the slow death of pretending I needed less than I actually did. Then I looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw 20 years of quiet longing and respect and the kind of attention I'd forgotten I deserved. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "Then yes." He opened the box, and the ring inside was nothing like the practical solitaire David had proposed with. This was vintage, Art Deco, with a center stone surrounded by smaller diamonds that caught the light like stars. It was romantic and unique and completely perfect, the kind of ring a man chooses when he's been thinking about a woman's hands for decades. He slipped it onto my finger, and it fit like it had been waiting for me all this time. "What happens now?" I asked, staring at the ring that felt both foreign and completely right. "Now we figure it out together. But first, you need to go home and tell David it's over. And Claire?" He cupped my face in his hands, and I could see tears in his eyes. "You're not too old for anything. You're just getting started." I drove home in a daze, the ring feeling both weightless and heavy on my finger. David was already in bed when I got there, didn't even ask how I'd gotten home or why I'd left, just mumbled something about the restaurant being overpriced and rolled over. I lay awake all night staring at the ceiling, turning the ring around my finger, and planning how to dismantle a life that had stopped feeling like mine years ago. The next morning, while David was in the shower, I called in sick to school. Then I called my sister Jenna in Portland and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Claire, I've been waiting 20 years for you to wake up. When do I get to meet my future brother-in-law?" That afternoon, I started packing. Not everything, just the things that mattered. My books, my grandmother's china, the photo albums David never looked at anyway. I was folding clothes into suitcases when he found me. "What's this about?" he asked, looking more annoyed than concerned. "It's about me acting my age," I said without looking up. "Turns out 52 is old enough to know when I deserve better." "Don't be ridiculous. You're upset about last night. Fine, I'll take you to dinner again next week." I stopped packing and turned to face him. "David, I'm leaving you. I'm filing for divorce and I'm marrying your brother." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the neighbor's dog barking 3 houses down. His face went through several expressions before settling on disbelief. "You're having some kind of breakdown," he said finally. "Women your age, it happens, we'll get you help." "I'm not having a breakdown. I'm having a breakthrough." I held up my hand, letting him see the ring Marcus had given me. "He's been in love with me for 20 years, David. 20 years of treating me like I matter, like I'm worth listening to, while you've been treating me like furniture." That's when the anger hit. Not the explosive kind, but the cold, calculating variety that told me he was already thinking about how to spin this to make me the villain. "You're making a mistake. Marcus doesn't have anything to offer you. No stability, no future. He's a perpetual bachelor who travels for work and lives in a 1-bedroom apartment. He offers me love, actual love, not just tolerance and shared bills. This is about sex, isn't it? You're having some kind of midlife crisis and thinking Marcus is going to make you feel young again. It's pathetic." I zipped up the suitcase and faced him fully. "You know what's pathetic, David? Spending 26 years with a woman and never once making her feel desired. Never once making her feel like you chose her, not just settled for her. Marcus doesn't make me feel young, he makes me feel valued. There's a difference." I carried my bags to the car while David followed, alternating between trying to convince me I was making a mistake and threatening to make the divorce difficult. I let him talk until I was ready to drive away, then rolled down the window and said, "By the way, you'll be getting papers next week. I've already spoken to an attorney." The look on his face was worth every uncomfortable conversation that was coming. I drove straight to Marcus's apartment, which wasn't the sad bachelor pad David had described, but a cozy space with good books and travel photographs, and windows that let in actual light. He took my bags without comment, made me tea in a mug that said "Life's an Adventure," and let me cry for 20 minutes about how scared I was. "What if this is crazy?" I asked when the tears finally stopped. "What if we're both just running away from our problems? Then we'll figure it out together," he said, the same thing he'd promised in the parking lot. "But Claire, this isn't running away. This is running towards something better." That night, we didn't sleep together. We stayed up until 3 in the morning talking about everything. Our childhoods, our dreams, the places we wanted to travel, the books we'd read, the years we'd spent pretending we didn't notice each other in ways that went beyond family politeness. It was the best conversation I'd had in decades. The next few weeks were chaos. David alternated between begging me to come home and threatening to destroy me in divorce court. Our daughters, Emma and Sophie, were initially shocked, then angry, then gradually supportive as they realized how unhappy I'd been for years. The family gossip network went into overdrive, with David's sister Patricia calling me a homewrecker, and his mother refusing to speak to either Marcus or me. But there were also unexpected allies. My teacher friends, who'd watched me shrink into myself over the years. Neighbors who admitted they'd always thought David was cold. Even some of David's own family members who quietly reached out to say they understood. The divorce moved faster than expected. David had wanted to fight, but his lawyer apparently convinced him that his chances of getting much in a no-fault state were slim, especially when I had documentation of my financial contributions to our joint assets and 26 years of putting his career first. We split everything down the middle, sold the house, and I walked away with enough money to start fresh. Marcus and I didn't rush into marriage. We dated properly, like teenagers who'd finally gotten permission to be together. He took me to places David had always said were too expensive or too frivolous. Art galleries and jazz clubs and weekend trips to bed and breakfasts where we could sleep late and have breakfast in actual bed. He brought me flowers for no reason, left little notes in my purse, and listened when I talked about my day like every detail mattered. 6 months after that night in the restaurant parking lot, he proposed again. Properly this time, at sunset on the beach in Maine where we'd gone for a long weekend. I said yes again, and we set a date for the following spring. The wedding was small, held in my sister's garden in Portland with 25 people who actually cared about our happiness. David wasn't invited, but our daughters were there, and even some of Marcus's family who'd decided love was more important than scandal. I wore a tea-length dress in champagne silk that made me feel elegant rather than trying too hard to look young. Marcus wore a navy suit and cried when he saw me walking down the aisle between the rose bushes. During our vows, I promised to never again pretend I needed less than I deserved. He promised to spend every day proving that love doesn't diminish with age. It intensifies. The reception was exactly what I'd always wanted but never thought to ask for. String quartet, good wine, dancing under lights strung between the trees. When Marcus and I had our first dance to At Last by Etta James, I felt like I was finally inhabiting my own life, instead of watching it happen to someone else. That was 8 months ago. Now we live in a house we chose together, with big windows and colorful walls, and a garden where we plant vegetables and herbs that we actually use. Marcus still travels for his consulting work, but now I go with him sometimes. We've been to Santa Fe and Charleston, and next month we're going to Ireland, the trip David always said we couldn't afford. I still teach 3rd grade, but at a different school where nobody knew me as David's quiet wife. My students think Mr. Marcus is the coolest when he comes to read to them on Fridays, and they love hearing about the places we've traveled together. I feel younger now than I did at 45, not because I'm trying to recapture my youth, but because I'm finally living as myself, instead of as someone else's idea of who I should be. David remarried 6 months after our divorce was final. A woman named Janet who works in his office and apparently appreciates his practical approach to relationships. I heard through the family grapevine that their wedding was exactly what mine had been. Efficient, sensible, and utterly without romance. I genuinely hope she's happy with that, because some people are. But I'm not some people. I'm a woman who learned at 52 that it's never too late to choose differently, to demand better, to believe that you're worth someone's whole heart instead of their leftover attention. Age doesn't make you less worthy of love. It makes you more selective about accepting anything less than the real thing. The best part isn't even the romance, though Marcus still brings me coffee in bed every morning and slow dances with me in the kitchen while dinner cooks. The best part is remembering who I am when I'm with someone who sees me clearly. I'm funny and opinionated and passionate about things David used to dismiss as unimportant. I have dreams and preferences and needs that matter. I take up space in my own life now, instead of apologizing for existing in the margins of someone else's. Last week, we ran into David at the grocery store. He looked older, grayer, and when he saw us together, his face went through that same series of expressions I remembered from the day I left. Disbelief, anger, something that might have been regret. Marcus nodded politely and kept his arm around my waist while I selected peaches that were perfectly ripe. As we walked away, I heard David call my name. When I turned, he said, "You look good, Claire, happy." I am happy, I told him. Finally. That night, Marcus and I sat on our back porch with wine and talked about planning a trip to Italy in the fall. He showed me pictures of Tuscany on his tablet while I leaned against his shoulder, and I thought about how different my life would be if I'd accepted David's verdict that romance was embarrassing at 52. Instead, I learned that 52 is exactly the right age to stop settling. It's the age when you finally understand the difference between companionship and partnership, between being married and being loved, between accepting what you're given and choosing what you deserve. Some people think love stories are for young people, that passion fades, and practical partnership is the best you can hope for in middle age. Those people are wrong. Love stories are for anyone brave enough to write their own ending, and some of the best chapters happen after you think the book is finished. I'm 53 now, and I've never felt more romantic, more desired, more alive in my own skin. Marcus and I are talking about adopting a dog, maybe taking dance lessons, definitely planning that trip to Ireland where we'll stay in castle hotels and drink whiskey by fireplaces and make love like we're 25 instead of acting our age. Because acting your age, as it turns out, doesn't mean shrinking or settling or accepting less than your worth. It means knowing exactly who you are and what you deserve, and being brave enough to go after it no matter what anyone else thinks about the timeline. David was right about one thing. I am 52. But he was wrong about everything else. 52 isn't too old for romance. It's just old enough to know the difference between the real thing and a pale imitation. And once you know that difference, you'll never settle for anything less than the real thing again. Tomorrow, Marcus and I are driving up to see the fall foliage in Vermont. We'll stay at a little inn that serves breakfast by the fireplace and has rooms with clawfoot tubs and windows overlooking mountains that are older than any of our problems. We'll hold hands while we walk through covered bridges and small towns that smell like cinnamon and wood smoke. He'll take pictures of me laughing in the golden light, and I'll feel beautiful not because I look younger but because I'm finally, completely, myself. That's what real love does. It doesn't make you young again. It makes you authentic. And authentic, I've learned, is infinitely more attractive than young ever was. 3 weeks after I moved in with Marcus, David showed up at my school. I was in the middle of reading Charlotte's Web to my third graders when Mrs. Henderson knocked on my classroom door and whispered that my husband was in the principal's office asking to speak with me. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd chosen to interrupt the chapter where Charlotte saves Wilbur by refusing to accept that his fate was sealed. I told my students to continue reading silently and walked down the familiar hallway feeling like I was moving through water. David sat in Principal Martinez's office, looking completely out of place among the colorful student artwork and motivational posters. He'd dressed up for this confrontation, wearing the navy suit he usually reserved for important client meetings, and his hair was freshly cut. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. "Claire, we need to talk," he said as soon as I entered. Principal Martinez excused herself with obvious discomfort, and suddenly we were alone in a room that smelled like disinfectant and childhood dreams. "You can't do this here, David. I'm working. You won't answer my calls. You won't see me at the house. What choice do I have?" He stood up and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "This is insane, Claire. You're throwing away 26 years for what? A midlife crisis? Some fantasy about my brother?" I sat down across from where he'd been sitting, maintaining the desk between us like a barrier. "It's not a fantasy. And it's not about your brother, not really. It's about me finally understanding what I deserve." "What you deserve?" His voice cracked on the words. "I gave you everything. A house, stability, 2 beautiful daughters. I worked 60 hours a week so you could teach elementary school, instead of getting a real job that paid decent money. I never cheated, never gambled, never drank too much. What more did you want?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized he genuinely didn't know. After 26 years of marriage, he had no idea what was missing, because he'd never bothered to ask. He saw marriage as a contract where you provided practical benefits and received practical benefits in return. Love, passion, emotional intimacy. Those were extras, not essentials. I wanted to feel chosen, David. Every day, not just on our wedding day. I wanted to feel like you enjoyed my company, like you were interested in my thoughts, like you found me attractive. I wanted to feel like your wife, not your employee. He shook his head impatiently. "That's fairy tale stuff, Claire. Real marriage isn't like the movies. It's about partnership, building a life together, being practical. And what about being happy? The question seemed to genuinely confuse him. You were happy. You never complained. I stopped complaining because complaining didn't change anything, but not complaining isn't the same as being happy. He sat back down heavily, and for the first time since I'd known him, David looked lost. So what, you're just going to pretend the last 26 years didn't happen? Start over like some teenager? I'm not pretending anything didn't happen. Those years taught me who I am and what I don't want to accept anymore. And I'm not starting over like a teenager. I'm starting over like a woman who finally knows her worth. With Marcus. He said his brother's name like it was something distasteful. Do you have any idea what people are saying? What this is doing to my reputation? There it was. Not concern for my happiness or even grief over losing me, but worry about how my choices reflected on him. I stood up and smoothed down my skirt, the same gesture I'd made 1,000 times in this office during parent conferences and faculty meetings. Your reputation will survive, David. You'll probably be seen as the victim in all this. The loyal husband whose ungrateful wife ran off with his charming brother. People love that narrative. Is that what you think this is? Some kind of revenge against me? I walked to the door and put my hand on the handle before turning back. No, David. If this were about revenge, I would have stayed married to you. That would have been the cruelest thing I could do to both of us. I left him sitting in that office and returned to my classroom, where 28 eight-year-olds were waiting to find out whether Charlotte's plan would work. As I picked up the book and continued reading about friendship and sacrifice and the courage to change your fate, I felt something settle inside me that had been restless for years. That evening, I told Marcus about David's visit while we cooked dinner together in his small kitchen. He listened without interrupting, stirring the pasta sauce while I chopped vegetables for the salad. It was such a simple domestic scene, but it felt revolutionary after decades of cooking alone while David watched television in the next room. Are you having second thoughts? Marcus asked finally, and I could hear the carefully controlled worry in his voice. About leaving David? Not for a second. I set down the knife and turned to face him. But I keep wondering if I'm being fair to you. You've been waiting 20 years for something that might not be what you imagined. I come with a lot of baggage, Marcus. An ugly divorce, complicated relationships with my daughters, family drama that's never gonna go away. He turned off the burner and moved closer, close enough to take my hands in his. Claire, I didn't wait 20 years for the idea of you. I waited for you. The real you, with all your complications and history and stubborn independence. I don't want some simplified version of who you might have been if you'd never married David. I want exactly who you are right now. We ate dinner on his tiny balcony overlooking the parking lot, and somehow it felt more romantic than any fancy restaurant. We talked about his upcoming business trip to Chicago and whether I might want to come along. We discussed the book I was reading to my students and the photography class he was thinking about taking. We planned a weekend trip to visit my sister Jenna in Portland and debated the merits of different pasta shapes with the seriousness of people who had finally found someone who shared their peculiar interests. Later we made love with the windows open and the city lights painting patterns on the walls. It wasn't desperate or frantic like the passion you see in movies about affairs. It was patient and thorough and full of 20 years, worth of accumulated tenderness. Afterward, we lay talking in the dark about everything and nothing, and I realized this was what I'd been missing. Not just physical intimacy, but emotional nakedness. The willingness to be completely known by another person. The next morning brought the first real test of our new reality. Emma, my older daughter, called while Marcus was in the shower. She'd been avoiding me since I'd told her about the divorce, communicating only through terse text messages that made it clear she thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Mom, I need to understand what you're thinking, she said without preamble. Sophie and I have been talking, and we're worried about you. This isn't like you. I poured myself coffee and sat at Marcus's kitchen table, looking out at the morning sun streaming through windows that actually faced east, unlike our old house where David had insisted trees were more important than light. What isn't like me, Emma? Leaving Dad, breaking up our family, moving in with Uncle Marcus like some kind of... She trailed off, but I could hear the judgment in her pause. Like some kind of what? I don't know. Like you're trying to relive your youth or something. It's embarrassing, Mom. There was that word again. Embarrassing. I wondered if David had coached her, or if the family tendency toward emotional dismissal was just genetic. Emma, when's the last time you saw your father and me happy together? Really happy? Not just tolerating each other? She was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. But you don't just throw away a marriage because you're not happy every minute. That's not how it works. You're right. You don't throw away a marriage because you have a few bad days, or because you're going through a rough patch. But you also don't stay in a marriage where you've disappeared completely, where you've become so small and quiet that your own husband thinks romance is embarrassing. Dad said you were having a midlife crisis. Maybe I am. Maybe realizing you deserve better at 52 is exactly what a midlife crisis should look like. I heard the shower turn off, and Marcus's voice humming something off-key. Emma, I love you and Sophie more than anything, but I can't live my life to make other people comfortable. Not anymore. What about us? What about our family? You and Sophie will always be my daughters. Always. But you're both adults with your own lives now. You don't need me to stay trapped in an unhappy marriage to maintain some illusion of family stability. She was crying now, quiet sniffles that broke my heart. I just don't understand how you could fall in love with Uncle Marcus. How long has this been going on? It's not what you think. I never had an affair, never even acknowledged that there might be feelings there, until after your father made it clear that he was done with me emotionally. Marcus waited 20 years for me to be free, Emma. 20 years of watching me try to make your father happy while forgetting to make myself happy. But he's Dad's brother. Yes, he is. And that makes this complicated and painful for everyone. But it doesn't make it wrong. We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the end of the call, Emma wasn't ready to give me her blessing, but she wasn't ready to write me off either. It was progress, even if it didn't feel like it. Marcus emerged from the bathroom with a towel around his waist and concern written all over his face. How'd it go? She thinks I'm having a midlife crisis and destroying the family. Are you? I considered the question seriously. Maybe. But if choosing happiness at 52 is a crisis, then I'll take it over the alternative. He kissed the top of my head and went to get dressed for work. I sat at his table drinking coffee and thinking about the conversation with Emma. She wasn't wrong that this was complicated. Falling in love with my ex-husband's brother wasn't exactly following the conventional path to happiness. But conventional paths hadn't been working for me. The phone rang again 20 minutes later. This time it was Sophie, my younger daughter, calling from her apartment in Boston, where she worked for a nonprofit that provided legal aid to low-income families. Mom, Emma called me. She's pretty upset. I imagine she is. Are you happy? The question was so direct it startled me. Yes, I said without hesitation. For the first time in years, I'm actually happy. Then I'm happy for you. I almost started crying right there in Marcus's kitchen. Really? Mom, I watched you and Dad together at Christmas last year. You barely spoke to each other. When you did talk, it was about logistics. Who was picking up what time we were eating, whether someone needed to run to the store. I kept thinking, is this what marriage looks like? Because if it is, I never want to get married. Sophie had always been more perceptive than Emma, more willing to see uncomfortable truths. Even as a child, she'd been the one to point out when the emperor had no clothes. Your father isn't a bad man, Sophie. He's just not the right man for me. Maybe he never was, but I was too young and too insecure to recognize it. And Uncle Marcus is the right man? I thought about Marcus in the shower humming off-key, about the way he listened when I talked about my day, about how he made me feel like my thoughts and feelings and dreams mattered. I think so. I hope so. Good. Life's too short to spend it with someone who makes you feel invisible. After we hung up, I sat in Marcus's kitchen feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Sophie's blessing didn't solve all our problems or make the situation less complicated. But it reminded me that I was modeling something for my daughters. Not just the courage to leave when you're unhappy, but the belief that you're worth more than settling. That afternoon, I had my first appointment with Linda Chen, the divorce attorney Marcus had recommended. Her office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, with hardwood floors and tall windows that made it feel more like a therapist's office than a legal battleground. Linda was about my age. With graying hair she wore in an elegant chignon and the kind of direct gaze that made you feel like she could see through any nonsense you might be trying to sell yourself. She listened while I explained the situation, taking notes and asking occasional questions that cut straight to the heart of things. "So your husband wants to contest the divorce?" she asked when I finished. "He says he does. He thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown and that I'll come to my senses if he just waits long enough." Linda smiled grimly. "They always think that. Men like your husband don't understand that women can be done. Really done. Not just angry or hurt or looking for attention. Done." "Are you speaking from experience?" 23 years of marriage to a man who thought providing a paycheck was the same as providing love. The day I filed for divorce was the first day I could breathe properly in years. We spent 2 hours going through my financial situation, my employment history, and the assets David and I had accumulated over 26 years. The house, the retirement accounts, the life insurance policies. Even the vacation photos that documented a marriage that had looked functional from the outside, but felt empty from within. "The good news is that Massachusetts is a no-fault state," Linda explained. "Your husband can't prevent the divorce just because he doesn't want it. The bad news is that he can make the process difficult and expensive if he chooses to." "What do you think he'll do?" "Based on what you've told me? He'll try to drag it out, hoping you'll get tired of the fight and come back. Men like him don't believe women are capable of sustained independence. They think if they just make things inconvenient enough, you'll decide it's easier to stay." "But that won't work." Linda's smile was sharp as a blade. "Not if you really want out. And everything about your body language tells me you really want out." She was right. Sitting in that office, talking about dividing assets and custody schedules for daughters who were already adults, I felt nothing but relief. No second thoughts, no romantic nostalgia for the good times David and I had shared. Even thinking about those good times, I realized they were mostly moments when I'd successfully anticipated his needs or avoided his disapproval. That wasn't love. That was performance. I walked out of Linda's office with a folder full of documents to review and a court date scheduled for 6 weeks away. The divorce was real now, official, moving forward with the momentum of legal machinery. There would be no going back, even if I wanted to. That evening, Marcus and I drove out to Salem to walk along the waterfront and talk about what came next. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the harbor was full of sailboats taking advantage of one of the last warm weekends of the season. "Are you scared?" he asked as we sat on a bench, watching the sunset paint the water gold and pink. "Terrified," I admitted. "Not about leaving David, but about everything else. What if we're wrong about this? What if what we think is love is just rebellion? What if we're better as the people who almost got together than the people who actually did?" He was quiet for so long I started to worry I'd said too much, revealed too many doubts. Then he turned to face me and said, "Do you remember your 27th birthday?" I frowned, trying to place it. "That would have been 3 years after we got married." "No, not really. David forgot. He was supposed to take you out to dinner, but he got called into work for some client crisis. You were sitting on your front steps when I drove up, still dressed up from where you'd been waiting for him to come home." The memory came back in pieces. The blue dress I'd bought specially, the reservation I'd had to cancel, the crushing disappointment of spending another birthday alone. "You took me out instead," I said slowly. "To that little Italian place in the North End. Carla's. We talked for 4 hours. You told me about the book you were writing, the one about the teacher who solves mysteries in her spare time. You said you'd always wanted to travel to Greece, see the islands. You talked about maybe going back to school, getting a master's degree in education." I stared at him. "You remember all that?" "I remember everything about that night. It was the first time I'd ever seen you without David around. The first time you seemed completely yourself. And I thought, this is the woman my brother married, but he has no idea who she is. Whatever happened to that book I was writing? David told you it was a waste of time. Said you should focus on practical things instead of fantasies. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd forgotten about the book, about the dreams I'd shared with Marcus that night when I was 27, and still believed in my own possibilities. David had killed those dreams so gradually, I hadn't even noticed they were dying. I could still write it, I said suddenly. The book. I could finish it. Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that starts small and spreads until it transforms your entire face. You could do anything you want now, Claire. That's the point. We walked back to his truck hand in hand, and I felt something shift inside me. Not just relief at leaving David, but excitement about what came next. For the first time in decades, my future felt like a blank page, instead of a predetermined script. The next week brought a series of small battles that reminded me why I was fighting the big war. David's lawyer sent papers requesting spousal support, claiming I'd been financially dependent on him throughout our marriage and would need ongoing assistance to maintain my lifestyle. The request was absurd since I had my own career and pension, but it was clearly designed to make me feel powerless. Linda handled it with the kind of cool professionalism that made me grateful I was paying her hourly rate. He's trying to establish that you need him, she explained. It's a control tactic. We'll counter with documentation of your financial contributions to the household and evidence that you're perfectly capable of supporting yourself. Is this gonna get ugly? It's already ugly, Claire. The question is whether you're willing to fight back or if you're going to let him intimidate you into accepting less than you deserve. I thought about that conversation while I sat in my classroom the next morning, watching my students work quietly on their writing assignments. 8-year-olds understood fairness in a way that adults often forgot. If someone took their toy, they demanded it back. If someone was mean to them, they told a grown-up. They didn't spend years making excuses for bad behavior or convincing themselves they deserved less than kindness. During lunch, I called Linda and told her to fight every single unreasonable request David made. I wasn't going to be intimidated into accepting scraps from a marriage I'd given everything to build. That afternoon, Marcus picked me up from school with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine that cost more than I usually spent on groceries. We ate dinner on his balcony despite the October chill, wrapped in blankets and talking about his upcoming business trip to Portland. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "To Portland?" "Marcus, I can't just leave in the middle of the school week. Take a few personal days. We could visit your sister, see the Pacific Northwest. I have meetings Thursday and Friday, but we could fly out Wednesday and stay through the weekend." The old me would have immediately listed all the reasons it was impractical. My students needed consistency, I couldn't afford to miss work, it was too expensive, too spontaneous, too indulgent. But sitting there, wrapped in blankets with string lights twinkling in the distance, and Marcus looking at me like an adventure was always possible, I heard myself saying, "Okay. Really? Really? I'll call Mrs. Henderson tomorrow and arrange for a substitute." He kissed me then, right there on the balcony with Thai food growing cold on our plates, and I tasted freedom and possibility, and the sweet recklessness of a woman who was finally done making sensible choices that made everyone else comfortable. 3 days later, we were on a plane to Portland. I sat by the window watching Massachusetts disappear beneath the clouds and felt like I was literally rising above my old life. Marcus held my hand during takeoff and told me about the restaurant he'd researched for Thursday night, the bookstore he wanted to visit, the weekend market where we could buy fresh flowers and local honey. "Have you ever been to Portland?" he asked. "Just once, when Jenna first moved there. David said it was too far and too expensive to visit regularly." "What did you think of it?" I tried to remember that brief weekend visit 5 years earlier. "I loved it. The food, the art, the way everyone seemed so alive. But David complained about the rain and said the people were pretentious, so we never went back." Marcus squeezed my hand. "This time you can love it without apologizing." Jenna met us at the airport with a sign that said, "Runaway Lovers," in glittery purple letters, and a grin that could have powered the entire terminal. She hugged Marcus like he was already family and whispered in my ear, "He's even cuter than you said." Her house in the Alberta district was exactly what I'd expected from my artistic sister. Bold colors, mismatched furniture that somehow worked perfectly together, and walls covered with local art and photographs from her travels. The guest room had a queen bed, with a view of her garden and morning light that streamed through gauze curtains like something from a dream. "I can't believe you're finally here," Jenna said as we sat in her kitchen drinking wine and eating cheese she'd bought specially for our visit. "And I can't believe it took you this long to leave David. You never liked him. I never liked him for you. There's a difference." She turned to Marcus, who was examining her collection of vintage cookbooks. "No offense to your family, but your brother was never good enough for my sister." "None taken," Marcus said easily. "I've been thinking the same thing for 20 years. We spent the evening walking through Jenna's neighborhood, stopping at coffee shops and galleries and bookstores that stayed open late. Marcus bought me a novel by an author I'd never heard of, and a notebook with a leather cover that felt substantial in my hands. "For the book you're going to write," he said. That night, we made love in my sister's guest room, with Portland rain pattering against the windows, and the distant sound of music from the bar down the street. Afterward, we lay talking about the day and planning tomorrow's adventure, and I realized this was what happiness felt like. Not constant joy or excitement, but a deep sense of rightness, like all the pieces of my life had finally clicked into place. Marcus's business meetings went well, which left us free to explore the city together. We took a food tour that introduced us to local specialties and visited Powell's Books, where I got lost in the poetry section while Marcus browsed photography books. We walked across bridges and through parks, and ate dinner at a restaurant with a view of Mount Hood in the distance. On our last night, Jenna cooked us an elaborate farewell dinner with local wine and ingredients from the farmer's market. As we sat around her dining table with candles flickering and jazz playing softly in the background, I felt like I was seeing my life from a distance. 6 months ago, I'd been sitting in my beige dining room listening to David complain about his day while I picked at reheated leftovers. Now I was in Oregon with a man who loved me and a sister who supported me, planning a future that felt limitless. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked, catching me staring out at Jenna's garden. "How different everything is. How different I am." "You're not different," Jenna said firmly. "You're just finally being yourself again. This is who you were before you spent 26 years trying to be who David wanted you to be." The flight home felt different from the flight out. Portland had been an adventure, a test of whether Marcus and I could travel together, whether we enjoyed each other's company outside the intensity of our new relationship. We'd passed with flying colors. He was an easy traveler, patient with delays and curious about everything. He took pictures of me laughing at the airport and bought me magazines for the plane ride and held my hand when we hit turbulence over the Rockies. Back in Boston, reality set in quickly. I had a stack of papers from Linda about asset division and a voicemail from David, asking if we could discuss this situation like adults. Marcus had meetings to catch up on, and I had 28 third graders who wanted to hear about my trip and see pictures of the Pacific Northwest. But something fundamental had shifted during those 5 days away. I felt more solid in my choice, more confident in my right to choose happiness over obligation. Portland had shown me that there was a whole world beyond David's disapproval and my family's discomfort. Marcus and I weren't just running away from something. We were running towards something better. The divorce proceedings moved forward with the grinding inevitability of legal processes. David's lawyer continued to make unreasonable demands that Linda shot down with professional precision. The house went on the market and sold within 2 weeks to a young couple who loved the kitchen I'd renovated 3 years earlier with money from my teacher's pension. Emma gradually warmed to the idea of my happiness, though she still couldn't understand why it had to come at the cost of her family's stability. Sophie remained my strongest supporter, even offering to be my maid of honor whenever Marcus and I decided to make things official. "Are you going to marry him?" she asked during one of our weekly phone calls. "Eventually, I think. We're not rushing anything. We're just enjoying being together." "Good. You deserve to enjoy someone who enjoys you back." It was such a simple statement, but it captured everything that had been missing from my marriage to David. Mutual enjoyment. The pleasure of each other's company. The feeling that your partner was genuinely glad to see you at the end of each day. Marcus and I were building something different from what I'd had with David. Not just because the passion was still alive, but because we were building it on a foundation of actual compatibility rather than compromise and resignation. We liked the same books and movies. We shared similar values about travel and adventure and the importance of continuing to grow throughout your life. We made each other laugh in ways that felt natural and unforced. One evening in November, as we sat reading together on his couch, with jazz playing softly in the background, Marcus looked up from his book and said, "I love this." "What?" "This. Just being here with you, reading while you read, knowing you're happy." I marked my place in my novel and curled up against his shoulder. I never had this with David. Even in the beginning, when things were supposedly good, we never just enjoyed being quiet together. What did you do together? I thought about it, planned things, discussed logistics, went through motions. I paused. I don't think David actually likes my company. I think he likes the idea of having a wife, but not the reality of being married to me specifically. His loss. Yes, I said, and for the first time I truly meant it. It really is. The divorce was finalized on a cold Tuesday in December, exactly 8 months after that anniversary dinner that changed everything. I signed the papers in Linda's office while sleet tapped against the windows, and when it was over, I felt nothing but relief. Linda handed me copies of everything and said, "Congratulations, you're officially free." Walking out of that office with my maiden name legally restored and my financial independence secured, I felt like I was starting my life over at 52. Not because I was pretending to be younger, but because I was finally old enough to know what I wanted and brave enough to choose it. Marcus was waiting for me in the parking lot with coffee and a smile that made my heart skip. "How does it feel to be Claire Donovan again?" "Perfect," I said, and kissed him right there in the cold December air, while legal documents scattered like confetti in the wind. Marcus proposed to me properly 6 months after my divorce was finalized, on a warm June evening that smelled like honeysuckle and possibility. We were in the garden behind the house we'd bought together in Lexington, a 1920s colonial, with original hardwood floors and windows that let in morning light from 3 directions. I was deadheading roses while he grilled vegetables for dinner, both of us moving around each other in the easy choreography of people who'd learned to share space without losing themselves. "Claire," he said suddenly, and something in his voice made me look up from the flower bed. He was standing by the grill with a small velvet box in his hand, looking nervous in a way I'd never seen before. "I know we've talked about this, but I need to ask you properly. Will you marry me? Again, I mean. Officially this time." The ring was different from the one he'd given me in that restaurant parking lot 18 months earlier. This one was an emerald, surrounded by tiny diamonds, vintage Art Deco like the first, but more elaborate, more intentional. Later he would tell me he'd spent months searching antique shops and estate sales for something that felt right, something that honored both my love of old things and our new beginning. "Yes," I said, wiping dirt from my hands on my gardening apron. "Obviously, yes." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and it caught the evening light like green fire. Then he kissed me among the roses while the vegetables slightly burned on the grill, and I thought about how different this moment was from David's practical proposal 28 years earlier. That had been in our college apartment, squeezed between studying for finals and worrying about student loans. David had presented engagement as a logical next step, something we should do because we'd been dating for 3 years and it made financial sense to combine our resources. This felt like celebration rather than negotiation. Like Marcus was asking me to celebrate us rather than solve a problem. We set the date for September, partly because it would be beautiful, but mostly because we were both done waiting. We'd already been living as married people in every way that mattered. The ceremony would just make it legal and let us throw a party for the people who'd supported us through the chaos of the previous year. Emma had finally come around by then, though it had taken months of careful conversations and patience I wasn't always sure I possessed. The turning point had been Easter dinner at our new house, when she saw Marcus and me together in our own space, cooking in our own kitchen, comfortable in ways she'd never seen me comfortable with her father. "You seem different, Mom," she'd said as we cleaned up after dessert. "Lighter. I feel lighter. I think I'm starting to understand why you left Dad." Sophie had been our wedding planning enthusiast from the beginning. Full of ideas about flowers and music and venues, she'd also become genuinely fond of Marcus, appreciating his dry humor and the way he clearly adored her mother. "I've never seen you with someone who actually listens to you," she told me during one of our planning sessions. "Like, really listens. Dad always looked like he was waiting for you to finish talking so he could say what he wanted to say." The observation stung because it was accurate. David had been waiting for me to finish talking for 26 years. Marcus asked follow-up questions. We decided on a small ceremony at the Crane Estate in Ipswich, a mansion overlooking the ocean that we'd visited on one of our early weekend trips. The gardens there reminded me of English country estates, wild and formal at the same time, and the great house had rooms filled with light and history that felt appropriate for two people who'd found each other later in life. Planning the wedding became an exercise in figuring out who we were as a couple, separate from the drama of how we'd gotten together. We wanted something elegant, but not stuffy, romantic, but not overly sentimental. We chose a string quartet for the ceremony, and a jazz trio for the reception. The flowers would be seasonal wildflowers and garden roses in shades of cream and soft pink. The menu would feature local seafood and vegetables from farms on the North Shore. Most importantly, we decided that our wedding would be a celebration of beginning rather than an ending. Too many weddings felt like pageants, where the bride was the star and the groom was a supporting player. We wanted something that honored both of us equally and acknowledged that we were mature adults choosing each other with full knowledge of what we were getting into. The guest list was small by necessity and design. My immediate family, Marcus's close friends, a few colleagues from school, and the neighbors who'd become our friends since we'd moved to Lexington. Notably absent was David and most of his extended family, though his sister Patricia had surprised everyone by sending a wedding gift with a note that said, "I hope you're both very happy." The exception was his youngest brother Michael, who lived in California and had always maintained that family drama wasn't worth losing relationships over. He flew in for the wedding and brought his partner James, and their presence helped bridge the gap between Marcus's old life and our new one. "I'm glad you two finally figured it out," Michael said at the rehearsal dinner. I was starting to think Marcus was going to pine away like some character in a Victorian novel. The rehearsal dinner was at our house, catered by a local restaurant but served in our own dining room with flowers from our own garden. It felt intimate and personal, in ways that big hotel receptions never could. Marcus gave a toast about second chances and patience, and I gave one about the difference between settling and choosing. Then we all sat on the back deck drinking wine and telling stories until well past midnight. I slept at Jenna's hotel room that night, honoring the tradition of not seeing the groom before the ceremony even though we'd been living together for over a year. She helped me into my dress, a tea-length silk sheath in champagne that I'd found at a boutique in Cambridge. It was sophisticated without trying to make me look younger, elegant in a way that felt authentically me. "You look beautiful," Jenna said as she fastened my grandmother's pearl necklace. "But more than that, you look like yourself." The ceremony was at 4 p.m, when the light was golden and forgiving. I walked down the aisle to Pachelbel's canon played by the string quartet, and Marcus waited for me at the altar in a charcoal gray suit that made his eyes look even bluer. When he saw me, his face lit up with such genuine joy that several people in the small crowd started crying before the ceremony even began. We'd written our own vows, something David and I had never done. Mine talked about finding love when I'd given up looking for it, about the courage it takes to start over, and about choosing each other every day rather than just once. His talked about waiting being worth it, about second chances and deep friendship and growing old together with grace and humor. The officiant was a friend of Marcus's from college who'd become a Unitarian minister. He kept the ceremony brief and focused on the promises we were making rather than the institution of marriage in the abstract. When he pronounced us husband and wife, Marcus kissed me like he'd been waiting his whole life for permission, and our small crowd applauded with enthusiasm that made up for their limited numbers. The reception was on the terrace overlooking the ocean, with round tables for 8 and dancing under lights strung between the trees. The jazz trio played standards from the 40s and 50s, songs about enduring love and new beginnings. We had our first dance to The Way You Look Tonight, and Marcus sang along softly in my ear, making me laugh and cry at the same time. Emma danced with Marcus during the father-daughter dance, and I watched them talking seriously about something while they moved around the dance floor. Later, she told me they'd been discussing her own relationship and how she was learning to recognize the difference between compromise and sacrifice. Sophie gave a toast that made everyone cry, talking about watching her mother transform over the past 2 years and learning that it's never too late to choose happiness over security. She ended by saying, quote, "Marcus, thank you for seeing what we always saw in our mom, and for being brave enough to wait for her." The evening ended with sparklers on the terrace and jazz music floating over the ocean. Marcus and I stayed up until dawn with the last few guests, drinking champagne and dancing barefoot on the stone terrace, while the sun rose over the Atlantic. It felt like the perfect beginning to whatever came next. Our honeymoon was 3 weeks in Italy, something I'd dreamed about for years but never imagined actually doing. David had always said Europe was too expensive and too impractical for teachers' salaries. Marcus had been planning the trip secretly for months, coordinating with Sophie to make sure someone could feed our cat and water our plants. We flew into Rome and spent 4 days walking through ancient ruins and modern neighborhoods, eating gelato and drinking wine at sidewalk cafes. Marcus had studied Italian in college and delighted in ordering for both of us, though his pronunciation made our waiter in Trastevere smile with barely concealed amusement. From Rome we took the train to Florence, where we spent hours in the Uffizi looking at paintings I'd only seen in books. Marcus photographed me standing in front of Botticelli's Birth of Venus. And later we bought a print to hang in our bedroom at home. We took a cooking class where we learned to make fresh pasta and risotto, and the elderly Italian woman who taught us kept patting my hand and saying, "Brava," when I successfully rolled out pappardelle. The last week was in Positano, in a hotel room with a balcony overlooking the Mediterranean. We read books in the morning sun, and took long walks along coastal paths that wound between lemon groves and ancient villages. We made love with the windows open and the sound of waves below, and talked about everything and nothing while the sun set over water that looked like liquid gold. One evening, as we sat on our balcony sharing a bottle of local wine, Marcus asked if I had any regrets about how we'd gotten here. "About David, you mean? About the timing?" "About all of it. The mess, the family drama, the unconventional path." I thought about it seriously, watching fishing boats bob in the harbor below. I regret that it took me so long to figure out what I deserved. I regret that I wasted so many years trying to make David happy instead of making myself happy. But I don't regret us. I don't regret choosing you, even if the timing was complicated. I sometimes wonder if I should have said something sooner. Should have told you how I felt instead of waiting for you to figure it out on your own. If you had, I wouldn't have been ready to hear it. I needed to get to the point where I was done with my marriage because it wasn't working, not because there was a better option waiting. Otherwise, I would have spent the rest of my life wondering if I'd made the right choice. And now you know? Now I know. We came home to Lexington tanned and relaxed and more in love than ever. The house felt like ours in ways it hadn't before the wedding, like we'd officially claimed our space together. Marcus had hired someone to paint the guest bedroom while we were away, transforming it from neutral beige to a soft blue that made the morning light even prettier. I returned to teaching that fall with a new energy that my students noticed immediately. 8-year-olds are excellent observers of adult behavior, and they could tell their teacher was genuinely happy in ways that made the whole classroom feel lighter. "Mrs. Donovan, you smile a lot more this year," one of my students observed during reading time. "I do? Yeah. And you laugh at our jokes even when they're not that funny. Maybe I just think you're funnier this year. Or maybe you're happier." Children and their uncomfortable truths. Yes, I was happier. Profoundly, consistently happy in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Not because every day was perfect, but because I was living authentically for the first time in decades. Marcus and I settled into married life with the ease of people who'd already been partners in everything but name. We developed routines that honored both our need for togetherness and our individual interests. He traveled for work less frequently, choosing projects closer to home when possible. I started writing again, working on the mystery novel I'd abandoned years earlier, and discovering that my heroine had become more interesting now that her creator understood something about courage and reinvention. We hosted dinner parties in our dining room and went to book clubs and art openings together. We traveled to Montreal for a long weekend and drove to Vermont to see the fall foliage. We adopted a rescue dog named Winston, who slept on our bed and followed us around the house like he couldn't believe his good fortune in landing with people who were home every evening and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The first major test of our marriage came that Christmas, when Emma announced she was bringing her boyfriend home to meet everyone. This would be the first holiday where our family configuration was officially different, where I was Marcus's wife rather than David's ex-wife, where we were hosting Christmas dinner instead of attending someone else's. "Are you nervous?" Marcus asked as we decorated our tree with ornaments that were mostly mine but some his, creating new traditions from the pieces of our separate lives. Terrified. What if this is weird for the girls? What if David finds out we're all together and it becomes a thing? Then it becomes a thing and we deal with it. But, Claire, you can't live your life trying to manage other people's reactions to your happiness. He was right, as he usually was about emotional situations. I'd spent so many years tiptoeing around David's moods and other people's comfort levels that I'd forgotten I had the right to simply live my life and let others adjust to it. Christmas Eve was magical in ways I'd forgotten holidays could be. Emma and her boyfriend Jake arrived in the afternoon, and Sophie drove up from Boston with homemade cookies and a bottle of champagne. We cooked dinner together, all of us crowded into our kitchen, talking and laughing and getting in each other's way in the best possible sense. Jake was a good match for Emma, funny and kind and clearly smitten with her. He helped Marcus with the turkey while the rest of us prepared side dishes, and I could see Emma watching them interact with something like relief. She needed to see that her mother hadn't chosen a man who would compete with her children for attention, but rather someone who understood that loving me meant embracing the whole package. After dinner, we sat around the tree exchanging gifts and telling stories about past holidays. Sophie had made photo albums for everyone, including one for Marcus that traced our relationship from early family gatherings through our wedding photos. The last picture was from our honeymoon, the two of us laughing on that balcony in Positano with the Mediterranean sparkling behind us. "You look like yourselves," Emma said, studying the photo. "Not like you're trying to be someone else or prove something. Just like yourselves." It was the most accurate description of our relationship I'd ever heard. The second year of our marriage brought new challenges and deeper intimacy. Marcus's mother died suddenly of a heart attack, and I watched my husband grieve the complicated relationship they'd had, while also dealing with his family's dynamics around the funeral and estate. David attended the service, of course, and we managed to be politely civil to each other for the first time since I'd left him. "She always liked you," Marcus said as we drove home from the cemetery. "Even after everything happened, she said you were the best thing that ever happened to our family." I held his hand while he cried, and later that night we made love with the desperate tenderness of people who'd been reminded that time is precious and uncertain. Loss has a way of clarifying what matters, and what mattered was that we'd found each other and were brave enough to build something real together. My own health scare came 6 months later when a routine mammogram showed something suspicious. The 2 weeks between the initial test and the biopsy results were the longest of my life, made bearable only by Marcus's steady presence and refusal to catastrophize before we had real information. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it," he said as we sat in the doctor's waiting room. Together. The lump turned out to be benign, but the experience taught us both something about how solid our foundation really was. Marcus had been calm and practical, and emotionally available in exactly the ways I needed. I'd been able to lean on him without losing myself, to accept support without feeling diminished by it. This is what partnership actually looks like, I told Sophie during one of our weekly phone calls. Not just dividing up household chores, but being able to count on someone to hold you up when you can't hold yourself up. Did you ever have that with Dad? I thought about it honestly. I don't think so. When I was sick, your father was helpful in practical ways. He'd pick up prescriptions and make sure I had whatever I needed, but he was never really present with me in the fear or uncertainty. He wanted me to get better quickly so things could go back to normal. And Marcus? Marcus sat with me in the fear. He didn't try to fix it or rush me through it. He just stayed present until we got through it together. By our 3rd wedding anniversary, we'd created a life together that felt both stable and adventurous. We'd traveled to Ireland and Spain, taken a photography class together, and started hosting an annual summer party for our combined friend groups that had become one of the neighborhood's favorite events. I'd finished and self-published my mystery novel, something I never would have had the confidence to do during my marriage to David. It wasn't a bestseller, but it got positive reviews from readers who appreciated a middle-aged female detective with realistic problems and genuine intelligence. More importantly, finishing it proved to myself that my dreams from 25 years earlier hadn't been naive fantasies, but legitimate goals that deserved pursuit. Marcus had started his own consulting firm, taking the leap into entrepreneurship he'd been considering for years. Having a supportive partner who believed in his abilities made risks feel manageable rather than terrifying. We were both discovering that love doesn't make you more cautious. It makes you braver because you're not facing uncertainty alone. "I never thought I'd be this happy," I told him one evening as we sat on our back deck watching Winston chase fireflies in the garden. "Not at 55. I thought the big adventures were behind me." 55 is young for our generation, Marcus said. "We could have 30 more years together. 30 years of adventures." The thought was dizzying and wonderful. 30 years of waking up next to someone who was genuinely glad to see me each morning. 30 years of traveling and growing and discovering new things about ourselves and each other. 30 years of the kind of partnership I'd thought was a myth or something that only happened to other people. Our 4th anniversary brought unexpected news. Emma was engaged to Jake, and they wanted Marcus to co-officiate their wedding ceremony along with her grandfather on David's side. It was a gesture of acceptance and inclusion that moved both of us to tears. "She's become a different person since you left Dad," Sophie observed as we planned Emma's engagement party. "More confident, less anxious about everything. I think watching you choose happiness taught her that she could choose it too." The engagement party was at our house, with both families in attendance for the first time since our wedding. David came with his new wife Janet, and the interaction was surprisingly comfortable. Time and distance had mellowed his anger into something closer to resignation, and Janet seemed genuinely pleased to meet me. "Emma talks about you constantly," she told me as we stood together watching the young couple open gifts. "About how proud she is of the life you've built with Marcus. That means everything to me. You should know that David speaks well of you now. It took him a while to get there, but he acknowledges that the divorce was probably best for both of you." I watched my ex-husband laughing with Marcus over something Jake had said, and felt grateful that we'd all found our way to this place of civilized coexistence. Not friendship, exactly, but mutual respect and shared concern for our daughters' happiness. Emma's wedding the following spring was everything mine had been but bigger, more elaborate, more traditional. She wore a full white gown and had 6 bridesmaids and a reception for 200 people. But the heart of it was the same. 2 people who genuinely enjoyed each other making promises they intended to keep. During the father-daughter dance, I watched her dance with David and then with Marcus, and realized that she'd gained a stepfather without losing her father. The complicated circumstances of our family's reconfiguration had ultimately given her more love, not less. "Thank you," she whispered to me during the mother-daughter dance, "for showing me what real love looks like." Sophie met someone that summer, a lawyer named Alex, who worked for the same nonprofit and shared her passion for social justice. Watching her navigate the early stages of love with the confidence I'd never had at her age, I felt proud of what I'd modeled for my daughters simply by choosing to leave an unhappy marriage and find something better. "I know what to look for now," Sophie told me as we planned a weekend visit so we could meet Alex. "I know what it looks like when someone is genuinely excited to be with you, rather than just tolerating your presence." Marcus and I celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary by renewing our vows in our own garden, surrounded by the roses we'd planted together and the life we'd built from the ground up. It was a small ceremony, just immediate family and closest friends, but it felt more significant than our original wedding, because now we knew what we were promising. We'd been through illness and loss and family drama and career changes, and we'd emerged stronger rather than diminished. 5 years ago, I thought my life was essentially over. I said in my vows renewal speech, I thought the interesting parts were behind me, that I was too old for grand gestures or new beginnings. Marcus taught me that life doesn't end at 50. It just gets more intentional. The photographer captured us cutting our anniversary cake with Winston at our feet, and our family gathered around us. And later, that photo would go on our mantle, next to our original wedding picture. The comparison between the two images told the whole story. The same love, but deeper now, tested and proven and utterly secure. As I write this, we've been married for 7 years, and together for 8.5. I'm 59 now, and Marcus is 63, and we're planning early retirement so we can travel more extensively and maybe buy a small place in Italy where we can spend part of each year. I still teach, though I've moved to part-time, and focus on reading intervention for struggling students. The work feels more meaningful now because I'm doing it from choice rather than necessity. Marcus's business has grown to the point where he can be selective about projects, choosing work that interests him rather than simply pays the bills. We've become the couple our friends come to for advice about relationships and life transitions. Not because we're perfect, but because we're proof that it's possible to start over successfully, to find love and partnership and genuine happiness later in life. The secret, I told a friend who was contemplating divorce from her own emotionally distant husband, is knowing that you deserve better and being willing to risk everything comfortable for something authentic. Last month, David's second marriage ended in divorce. According to Emma, Janet had similar complaints to the ones I'd had. Emotional distance, lack of intimacy, feeling taken for granted. I felt sorry for both of them, trapped in patterns that prevented real connection. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed? Marcus asked when we heard the news. No, I said honestly. I know what would have happened. I would have gotten smaller and quieter until I disappeared completely. And now? Now I take up exactly as much space as I deserve, which is all of it. We were sitting on our deck at the time, drinking wine, and watching the sunset paint our garden gold. Winston was asleep at our feet, and Jazz was playing softly from the outdoor speakers Marcus had installed for our anniversary. I was wearing a dress he'd bought me in Florence, emerald green silk that brought out my eyes and made me feel beautiful at 59 in ways I'd never felt at 39. What do you want to do tomorrow? Marcus asked, refilling my wine glass. It was such a simple question, but it represented everything that was different about this life. Someone was asking what I wanted, and they genuinely cared about the answer. My opinion mattered. My preferences were considered. My happiness was a priority. Let's go to that new bookstore in Concord, I said, and then maybe drive out to see the leaves changing. And stop for lunch somewhere with a view. Perfect, he said, and kissed the top of my head. Absolutely perfect. Later that night, as we got ready for bed in the master bedroom we'd redecorated with soft blues and comfortable furniture that invited lingering, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror. I looked like a woman who was loved well and often, a woman who knew her worth and insisted on it, a woman who had refused to accept that romance ends at 52. My body showed the effects of nearly 60 years of living. There were lines around my eyes and silver in my hair and curves that hadn't been there in my 20s. But I also saw strength and confidence, and the glow that comes from being genuinely cherished by someone who thinks you're exactly right as you are. Marcus came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, and we stood together looking at our reflection. Two people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment, when they were old enough to know what love actually looked like, and young enough to build a life around it. No regrets? He asked, echoing a question that had become our private joke. Only one, I said, leaning back against his chest. I wish I'd been brave enough to choose happiness sooner. Then we might have missed each other entirely. He was right. If I'd left David at 35 or 45, I might have been looking for someone to rescue me rather than someone to partner with. I might have chosen security over authenticity, comfort over growth. I needed to be 52 and completely done with settling to recognize real love when it finally appeared. Besides, Marcus added, we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time. We made love that night with the windows open and the scent of night-blooming jasmine drifting in from the garden. Afterward, we lay talking about our plans for the weekend and the trip to Tuscany we were planning for the following spring, and the everyday magic of sharing a life with someone who thinks you're worth celebrating. As I drifted off to sleep in his arms, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years earlier, sitting in that restaurant listening to David tell me I was too old for romance. She couldn't have imagined this life, this love, this version of herself, who had learned to take up space and demand better and believe in second chances. The last thing I remember thinking before sleep was how grateful I was that David had been wrong about everything that mattered. I wasn't too old for romance. I was exactly the right age to recognize it when it found me, exactly wise enough to choose it over security, exactly brave enough to build something beautiful from the ashes of what hadn't worked. At 59, I was having the love story I'd dreamed of at 29 but hadn't been mature enough to create. At 59, I was proof that it's never too late to write a better ending to your own story. They said I was being dramatic when I found the receipt for the hotel room he'd booked for his business trip with my best friend Sarah, but what they didn't know was that I'd already hired the private investigator, already spoken to the lawyer, and already transferred half our joint savings to an account only I could access. By the time they realized I wasn't just hurt, I was strategic. Their affair was front-page news in our small town, and I was walking away with everything I deserved, plus interest on 23 years of lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk, asterisk. My name is Victoria Sterling, and until 6 months ago, I thought I was living the perfect small-town life. Married to Tom Sterling, the town's most successful real estate developer, living in the biggest house on Maple Street, president of the Country Club Auxiliary, and best friends with Sarah Matthews, who ran the local flower shop, and had been my confidant since college. I was 45, well-dressed, well-connected, and completely blind to the fact that my entire life was built on lies that everyone else could see but me. The first crack in my perfect facade came on a Thursday morning in March when I stopped by Sarah's shop to pick up flowers for the charity luncheon I was hosting that weekend. Blooms and Blossoms was usually busy, but that morning it was eerily quiet. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and I could hear Sarah's voice coming from the back office, hushed and intimate in a way that made me pause. "I can't wait until Saturday night," she was saying. "Tom promised he'd tell her about the business trip to Portland after the luncheon. We'll finally have a whole weekend together without sneaking around." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Tom was supposed to be going to Portland for a real estate conference. He'd shown me the brochure, complained about having to miss my charity luncheon, even asked me to pack his good suits. I stood frozen by the display of spring tulips, my mind racing through every business trip he'd taken in the past year, every evening he'd worked late, every weekend Sarah had been conveniently unavailable. "I know, darling," came a voice that made my knees nearly buckle. Tom's voice, warm and affectionate in a way he hadn't spoken to me in years. "Once we get through this weekend, we can start planning our future properly." I backed out of the shop as quietly as I'd entered, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my car keys. 23 years of marriage, and my husband was planning his future with my best friend, the woman who'd been maid of honor at our wedding, who'd held my hand through 2 miscarriages, who'd helped me plan surprise parties for Tom's birthdays, and celebrated every anniversary with us like she was genuinely happy for our success. I drove home in a daze, looking at our imposing colonial house with its perfect landscaping and circular driveway as if I were seeing it for the first time. Everything about it suddenly felt like a stage set, designed to impress other people rather than shelter the people who lived inside it. How long had Tom been pretending to love this life we'd built together? How long had Sarah been pretending to be my friend while planning to take my place? Instead of falling apart, something cold and calculating settled in my chest. I'd built my reputation in this town on being organized, thorough, and socially astute. If Tom and Sarah thought they could humiliate me and walk away with my life, they were about to learn exactly what those skills could accomplish when properly motivated. I spent that afternoon researching private investigators online, reading reviews and credentials with the same attention to detail I'd used to plan charity events and select campaign strategies for the mayor's races I'd managed. By 5 o'clock, I had an appointment scheduled with Rebecca Walsh, a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial investigations and had an office 20 miles away in the next county. Tom came home at his usual 6:30, kissing my cheek and asking about my day like he had for decades. I served him pot roast and mashed potatoes while he told me about property developments and zoning meetings, and I smiled and nodded and asked appropriate questions while studying his face for signs of the man who'd been whispering endearments to my best friend that morning. "Don't forget I leave for Portland tomorrow evening," he said as we cleaned up the dinner dishes. "The conference starts Saturday morning, and I probably won't be able to call much. You know how these things go." "Of course," I said smoothly. "I'll miss you, but the luncheon will keep me busy. Sarah's handling all the flowers, so I'm sure everything will be perfect." He didn't even flinch at Sarah's name. If anything, he looked pleased that his two favorite women were working together to make his deception easier. The next morning, I drove to Rebecca Walsh's office with a folder full of documentation: bank statements, credit card records, Tom's travel itinerary, and a detailed timeline of every suspicious behavior I'd noticed over the past year, but dismissed as stress or middle-age restlessness. Rebecca was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and the kind of direct manner I appreciated in business associates. "How long do you think this has been going on?" she asked after reviewing my materials. "I don't know, maybe a year? The late nights started around last Christmas, and he's been taking more overnight business trips since then. But it could have been longer. I haven't been paying attention." "Why do you want to know for certain?" "Some clients prefer to live with suspicions rather than face proof." I thought about that question seriously. Because I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with before I decide how to respond. If it's a recent thing, maybe it's salvageable. If it's been going on for years, if he's been making me look like a fool in front of the whole town, then I need different strategies. Rebecca smiled grimly. "I like working with clients who think strategically. Most people in your situation are too emotional to plan effectively. I'll have plenty of time to be emotional later. Right now, I need information." She quoted me a retainer fee that would have paid for a decent used car, but I wrote the check without hesitation. 23 years of marriage to a successful businessman had taught me that good professional advice was always worth paying for, and this was the most important professional advice I'd ever needed. The charity luncheon that Saturday was supposed to be the social highlight of my spring season. 50 women from the best families in town gathered in my dining room and sunroom to raise money for the local literacy program. I'd spent weeks planning the menu, arranging the flowers, and coordinating with Sarah to make sure everything looked perfect. Sarah arrived early to set up the floral arrangements, acting exactly like she had for every event we'd organized together over the past decade. She was cheerful, efficient, and full of compliments about my dress and the table settings. If I hadn't overheard her conversation with Tom the day before, I would never have suspected that she was counting down the hours until she could have her romantic weekend with my husband. "Everything looks beautiful, Vic," she said, using the nickname only she and Tom were allowed to use. "You always make these events look so effortless." "Years of practice," I replied, adjusting the centerpiece she'd created with spring flowers that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. "Tom left for Portland this morning. He was sorry to miss seeing your handiwork." She blushed slightly, and I realized that even that small reaction was probably genuine. She did care about Tom's opinion of her work, just not in the way I'd assumed. The luncheon itself was a tremendous success. We raised more money than ever before, received commitments for next year's committee positions, and I was complimented repeatedly on my organizational skills and gracious hosting. Several women mentioned that Tom was lucky to have such a capable wife, and I smiled and accepted their praise while mentally calculating how much of our joint assets I could legally claim in a divorce settlement. As the last guests were leaving, Sarah helped me clear the serving platters and stack the good china for washing. We worked together in the kitchen like we had hundreds of times before, and I found myself studying her with new eyes. She was attractive in an understated way, with the kind of natural beauty that looked good without much makeup or expensive styling. At 43, she was 2 years younger than me, unmarried, and had always claimed she was too busy with her business to seriously date anyone. Now I understood why she'd never seemed interested in the men I'd tried to set her up with over the years. She'd been waiting for mine. "Vic, can I ask you something?" she said as we loaded the dishwasher. Of course. Are you and Tom happy? I mean, really happy? The question was so audacious I almost laughed. She was asking permission to steal my husband while helping me clean up from a party she'd helped me host in the house he and I shared. Why do you ask? Sometimes you both seem like you're going through the motions, like you're playing roles instead of living your lives. All marriages have ups and downs, Sarah. Tom and I have been together for 23 years. We're not teenagers anymore. She nodded, but I could see in her expression that she thought she was offering Tom something I couldn't. Youth, perhaps, or passion, or simply the excitement of something new and forbidden. After she left, I sat in my pristine living room surrounded by the evidence of a perfect social event and felt the full weight of my situation settling over me. My marriage was ending whether I fought for it or not. The question was whether I would end it on my terms or theirs. Rebecca called me on Monday morning with her preliminary report. She'd followed Tom to the hotel where he'd met Sarah on Friday evening, and they'd spent the weekend together in a suite that cost more per night than most people earned in a week. She had photographs of them entering and leaving together, restaurant receipts from romantic dinners, and evidence that this particular hotel had been their regular meeting place for the past 8 months. There's more, she said. I ran a background check on your friend Sarah. Did you know she filed bankruptcy 3 years ago? Her flower shop is barely breaking even, and she's been struggling to make rent on both her business and personal spaces. The information hit me like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't just betrayed our friendship for love, she'd betrayed it for financial security. Tom represented an escape from her money troubles, and I represented the obstacle standing between her and a comfortable life. I need everything, I told Rebecca. Every detail, every receipt, every photograph. I need to know exactly how long this has been going on and exactly how much Tom has spent on this affair. Are you sure? Some clients find the details more painful than helpful. I'm sure. I can't make intelligent decisions without complete information. That week, while Tom was legitimately out of town on business and Sarah was running her failing flower shop, I met with Margaret Chen, the most ruthless divorce attorney in the state. Margaret had a reputation for destroying unfaithful spouses in court, and her retainer fee was even higher than Rebecca's had been. But she also had a reputation for getting her clients everything they deserved, plus damages for emotional distress when the circumstances warranted it. This is good, she said after reviewing Rebecca's report. Very good. Adultery with documentation, financial deception, and a clear pattern of behavior. How much are you worth as a couple? I handed her a financial summary I'd prepared after going through 5 years of tax returns and investment statements. Just over $3 million in assets, including the house and Tom's business interests. Most of it was built during our marriage using income we both contributed to, directly or indirectly. And you contributed how? I managed his social and professional networking for 20 years. Organized client entertainment, maintained relationships with key contacts, managed his political connections. I also inherited money from my parents that we used to expand his business in the early years. Margaret smiled the way a shark might smile if sharks could appreciate irony. So you helped build the business he's now using to fund his affair with your best friend? Essentially, yes. We're going to destroy them both, legally and ethically, but completely. I left her office feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Powerful. For too long, I'd been the victim in this situation. The woman being deceived and betrayed by the two people she trusted most. Now I was going to be the protagonist in my own story, the one who controlled the narrative and determined the ending. Tom returned from his business trip on Thursday evening, full of stories about successful meetings and new opportunities. He seemed relaxed and happy in ways he hadn't been around me in years, and I realized he was probably feeling relieved that his double life was going so smoothly. "How was your week?" he asked as we shared takeout Chinese food in our kitchen. "Productive. I've been thinking about some changes I want to make." "What kind of changes?" "Personal ones. I'll tell you more when I've figured out the details." He didn't press for specifics, which told me everything I needed to know about his level of interest in my inner life. The man who'd once claimed to love me completely was now perfectly content to live as strangers sharing a house and a bank account. The final piece of my strategy fell into place the following week, when Rebecca provided me with the smoking gun I'd been hoping for. Tom had been using our joint business account to pay for his affair expenses. The hotel rooms, the expensive dinners, the jewelry he'd bought Sarah for her birthday, all of it paid for with money that was legally half mine. Margaret filed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning, timing it for maximum impact. Tom would receive them at his office, where his secretary and business partners would witness his reaction. Sarah would be served with papers naming her as a co-respondent in an adultery case at her flower shop during the lunch rush, when half the town's gossips would be there ordering arrangements for spring weddings. I spent that morning at the salon getting my hair cut and styled, then stopped by the boutique where I bought a new dress in emerald green that made me look younger and more vibrant than I'd felt in years. If I was going to be the talk of the town, I wanted to look like a woman who was in control of her own destiny. Tom called me at 2 o'clock, his voice shaking with rage and something that might have been panic. "Victoria, what the hell is this, divorce papers? And they've named Sarah as a co-respondent? This is insane." "Is it?" I said calmly. "I have photographs of you checking into the Riverside Hotel with her last weekend. I have credit card records showing you've been paying for romantic dinners and expensive gifts for the past 8 months. I have receipts showing you used our joint account to fund your affair. Which part seems insane to you?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Finally, he said, "We need to talk." "No, we needed to talk 8 months ago when you decided to have an affair with my best friend. Now we need to let our lawyers talk." "Vic, please, this isn't what you think. Sarah and I, it's complicated." "It's really not complicated at all, Tom. You're both liars and cheaters, and now you're both going to face the consequences." He tried to argue, to explain, to somehow convince me that what I'd seen and documented wasn't what it appeared to be. But I'd moved past the phase of being gaslit and manipulated. I was in the phase of strategic response, and his emotional appeals were just more evidence of how little he understood about the woman he'd been married to for 23 years. The news spread through our small town like wildfire. By Wednesday evening, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from friends, acquaintances, and people I barely knew, all wanting to know if the rumors were true. I answered the calls from people I genuinely cared about, and let the rest go to voicemail. "I can't believe Sarah would do this to you," said Linda Morrison, who'd been in our book club for 15 years. "I always thought she was such a loyal friend." "People aren't always who they appear to be," I replied diplomatically. "I'm learning to accept that. And Tom, I would never have thought he was the type to have an affair. He always seemed so devoted to you." "He was devoted to the life I provided for him. Apparently, he thought he could get the same benefits from Sarah without the inconvenience of being married to me." By Friday, the local newspaper had picked up the story. Not the salacious details, but enough information to make it clear that the town's most prominent real estate developer was involved in a high-profile divorce involving adultery allegations. Tom's business partners were reportedly concerned about the negative publicity, and several major clients had postponed meetings pending resolution of his personal issues. Sarah closed her flower shop temporarily, claiming she needed time to deal with personal matters. The building owner told several people that she was behind on rent and might be facing eviction anyway. The narrative that was emerging wasn't just about an affair. It was about a financially desperate woman seducing a married man for his money and social position. I, meanwhile, was being painted as the dignified victim who'd handled her betrayal with class and intelligence. The town's social leaders rallied around me with a solidarity I hadn't expected. Women who'd known both Tom and me for decades were making it clear that they considered his behavior inexcusable and Sarah's behavior unforgivable. "You're handling this beautifully," said Patricia Williams, the mayor's wife, when she stopped by with a casserole and moral support. "A lot of women would have fallen apart or done something dramatic that they'd regret later. But you're being so strategic about everything." "I learned a long time ago that the best revenge is living well," I said. Though privately I thought the best revenge was living well while ensuring your enemies lived poorly. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, once Tom realized that fighting would only generate more negative publicity and cost him more money. Margaret had structured the case so thoroughly that his options were to settle generously or face a protracted court battle that would expose every detail of his affair to public scrutiny. He chose to settle. I got the house, half of all joint assets, and a substantial alimony payment that would ensure I could maintain my lifestyle indefinitely. He also had to pay all my legal fees, which were considerable given the thoroughness of our investigation and preparation. Sarah, meanwhile, was facing her own legal problems. Her bankruptcy attorney advised her to avoid any appearance of financial benefit from her relationship with Tom, which meant she couldn't accept expensive gifts or financial support during the divorce proceedings. She was stuck in her failing business with mounting debts, and no wealthy lover to rescue her. The irony was perfect. She'd betrayed our friendship to escape financial insecurity, but the legal consequences of that betrayal had made her financial situation even worse. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Tom and Sarah quietly left town together. He'd sold his business to his partners at a loss rather than face the continued social awkwardness of staying in a place where everyone knew the details of his personal scandal. Sarah had declared bankruptcy again and closed her flower shop permanently. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they'd moved to Arizona, where Tom was working for someone else's real estate firm, and Sarah was looking for employment in retail. They were starting over together, but starting from a much lower position than either of them had expected when they began their affair. I stayed in our house on Maple Street, but I redecorated completely. Gone were the formal traditional furnishings that Tom had preferred, replaced with comfortable contemporary pieces in colors that made me happy. I converted his home office into a craft room where I could pursue the photography hobby I'd abandoned when we got married. I planted a vegetable garden in the backyard and adopted 2 cats from the animal shelter. Most importantly, I began building genuine friendships with women who valued loyalty and honesty. My experience with Sarah had taught me to be more careful about trusting people, but it had also taught me to value the friends who stood by me during the crisis. Linda Morrison and Patricia Williams became much closer friends than they'd been before, partly because we'd bonded over the shared crisis, but mostly because I was more authentic now. I wasn't performing the role of the perfect wife anymore. I was just being myself, flaws and opinions and all. "You seem so much happier," Linda observed one evening, as we sat on my deck drinking wine and watching the sunset. "I know the divorce was hard, but you seem lighter somehow." "I feel lighter. I didn't realize how much energy it took to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't." "Do you miss Tom at all?" I considered the question seriously. I miss the version of Tom I thought I was married to. But I don't think that version ever really existed. I miss the idea of having a partner, but I don't miss the reality of being married to someone who was fundamentally dishonest with me. A year after the divorce, I sold the house on Maple Street and bought a smaller but more charming Victorian cottage on the other side of town. The cottage had character and history and required some renovation work, but it felt like mine in ways the big colonial never had. I was building a life that reflected my actual preferences rather than someone else's expectations. I also started dating, though cautiously. Margaret had introduced me to her brother David, a widowed professor who taught history at the local college. He was kind, intelligent, and refreshingly straightforward about his intentions and feelings. We'd been seeing each other for 6 months, taking things slowly and building a friendship alongside the romantic relationship. "I appreciate that you know what you want," he told me over dinner at our favorite restaurant. "A lot of people our age are carrying so much baggage from past relationships that they can't be present in new ones. I have baggage too," I said. "But I've unpacked it and decided what to keep and what to throw away." The difference between my relationship with David and my marriage to Tom was striking. David was interested in my opinions, supportive of my interests, and honest about his own needs and concerns. We disagreed about things sometimes, but we talked through our differences instead of avoiding them. He made me feel valued for who I actually was, rather than for what I could do for him. "I can't imagine being dishonest with you," he said one evening as we worked together in my garden. "Not because I think you'd leave me, but because I can't imagine wanting to be with someone I had to lie to." 2 years after my divorce, I ran into Sarah at a coffee shop during a weekend trip to Portland. She looked older and tired, wearing clothes that had seen better days and working as a barista at a chain store. When she saw me, she looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. "Hello, Sarah," I said calmly. "Victoria, I heard you were doing well." "I am. How are you?" She glanced around nervously, clearly uncomfortable being seen with me in public. "I'm okay. Tom and we're making it work." I nodded politely, but didn't ask for details. I could see from her appearance and demeanor that they weren't making it work very well, but that was no longer my concern. I want you to know, she said suddenly. I never meant for things to happen the way they did. It wasn't about hurting you. No, I agreed. It was about what you thought was best for yourself. I understand that. Do you hate me? The question surprised me. I'd expected her to apologize or make excuses, not ask about my feelings toward her. No, I don't hate you. I don't really think about you at all anymore. It was true. The woman who had once been my closest friend had become irrelevant to my life. She'd made choices that revealed her character, and I'd made choices that revealed mine. We were both living with the consequences, but only one of us seemed to be thriving. As I drove home from Portland that weekend, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in 2.5 years. I'd gone from being the betrayed wife trying to save face to being a confident single woman building a life around her own values and desires. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every difficult moment. The house Tom and Sarah had thought they were clever enough to steal had become the foundation of my independence. The friends they'd assumed would take their side had become my strongest supporters. The reputation they'd tried to damage had emerged stronger than ever, built on truth instead of pretense. Most importantly, I'd learned that being strategic wasn't the opposite of being emotional. It was emotional intelligence in action. My anger at their betrayal had motivated me to protect myself effectively. My hurt at losing my marriage had taught me what I actually wanted in a relationship. My disappointment in Sarah's friendship had shown me what qualities to value in real friends. 3 years after the divorce, David proposed to me in my garden, on a warm September evening. The ring was beautiful but not ostentatious, chosen for my taste rather than for public display. His proposal was heartfelt and honest, acknowledging both the joy of finding each other and the hard work of building something lasting. I know you've been hurt before, he said, and I know you're careful about trusting people now. But I want you to know that I see this as the beginning of something we'll build together, not something I'm trying to take from you or something you're trying to give me. I said yes, of course, but I also appreciated that he understood the difference between my caution and fear. I wasn't afraid of marriage. I was selective about partnership. I'd learned the difference between settling for someone and choosing someone, and I was finally experienced enough to make the choice wisely. Our wedding the following spring was everything Tom and Sarah's clandestine affair had not been. Honest, public, and celebrated by people who genuinely cared about our happiness. We married in the garden of my cottage, surrounded by friends who'd watched me rebuild my life from scratch, and who knew that this relationship was built on authenticity rather than deception. As I danced with my new husband at our small reception, I caught sight of Linda and Patricia raising their glasses in a toast, and I realized that the greatest revenge against Tom and Sarah hadn't been the legal victory or the social vindication. It had been building a life so much better than the one they'd tried to destroy that their betrayal had become a gift rather than a tragedy. They'd thought they were taking my future when they took my marriage. Instead, they'd freed me to create a future I actually wanted. Sometimes the best thing people can do for you is show you who they really are, before you waste any more time pretending they're someone else. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.